The ayes have it. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Former Treasurer Peter Costello reckons that he'll be dead before the government pays back its debt. Will the Prime Minister confirm that his government's record includes gross debt increasing to a record $500 billion, net debt doubling, and net debt as a proportion of the economy is growing more rapidly than almost every advanced economy in the world?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. We're not going to take lectures from the Labor Party on debt and deficit. Even after robbing retirees, self-funded retirees, discriminating against them, seizing the benefit of franking credits from them in a cash grab, even after that, they still can't make their financial plans add up. They want to put money on the public's credit card, as they always have. Remember, at the last election, they went to the election with the promise of $16.5 billion of higher deficits over the forward estimates, plus billions of dollars of additional taxes. They still can't make their budget plans add up with $200 billion of additional taxes planned. Mr Speaker, there isn't a tax that the Labor Party doesn't want to increase. There are taxes that they used to be in favour of lowering that they now want to increase. Mr Speaker, the House has heard many times the very eloquent testimony the Leader of the Opposition gave, as many of his predecessors and colleagues have, to the way in which reducing business taxes increases investment, increases economic growth and increases jobs. They've heard all of that, and yet they chewed up, they spent the cash at the bank that Peter Costello left them after the Labor Party came in 2007, and set us up with a structural deficit that we have been unwinding ever since. And we are bringing the budget back into balance. We're bringing the budget back into balance, and we're doing that with the responsible economic management that the Labor Party can never deliver, because a strong budget depends on strong economic growth coupled with strong economic leadership, and we are delivering both. And that is why we have, over the last calendar year in 2017, the largest jobs growth in our country's history. We promised jobs and growth in 2016, and that's precisely what we're delivering, and the Treasurer will have more to say about that at 7:30 tonight.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is building a stronger economy to guarantee the essential services upon which Australians rely? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
For a question, and the honourable member, like all honourable members on our side, recognises that the foundation of guaranteeing essential services, building the infrastructure that we need, ensuring we have record funding for schools and hospitals and Medicare, all of that depends on a strong economy that delivers more jobs and better jobs for Australians, an economy where business has the confidence to invest, and an economy which enables us to provide tax relief to support hard-working Australians and their families and take some of that cost of living pressure off Australian households. Mr Speaker, every element of our responsible budget that the Treasurer will deliver tonight is built on the foundation of a strong economy. And so it isn't a choice between having a strong economy and policies to spend more on essential services like health and education, on defence, on national security. The reality is you can't do one without the other, and that is why we are able to invest more on congestion-busting infrastructure around the country, on life-saving medicines like Spinraza, a groundbreaking treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, or Optivo, a treatment for lung cancer and renal cell cancer. One life-saving drug after another going onto the PBS We can afford to do it because we have a stronger economy. And, Mr Speaker, we're seeing record jobs growth, over 1,000 a day. And, Mr Speaker, last calendar year, the highest jobs growth, 415,000, in any calendar year in our history. Now, Mr Speaker, that demonstrates the strength of our economy. It's part of our plan to grow the economy with policies that back business to create jobs, build the economic infrastructure we need, put downward pressure on the cost of electricity so that household power bills are as low as they can be, and provide more opportunities for our farmers, manufacturers and exporters by securing new trade deals, helping younger Australians into work through our Path Jobs program. Now, every element of that would be put at risk by a Labor government. The Labor Party does not have one policy that would create one job or deliver one additional dollar of investment. And, Mr Speaker, we saw in the Leader of the Opposition's budget in reply last year a pledge to pull out of the TPP. This is when he was urging me to stop being deluded and trying to get it passed, trying to get it agreed to. Well, that agreement stands for free trade, stands for jobs, stands for investment, and that's how we're creating jobs, and they're the jobs, the thousands of jobs that a Labor government would threaten.
The time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Former Howard Government Treasurer Peter Costello says he'll be dead before the government pays back its debt. Can the Prime Minister confirm that since this government came to office, gross debt has increased to a record $500 billion, and that gross debt will be even higher in tonight's budget?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, I heard the honourable member today talking about debt and deficit. I heard him talking about the fact that, alleging that the stronger revenues he was foreshadowing in the budget were all the result of stronger global economic growth. In fact, it had nothing to do with Australia. It didn't give Australians any credit for any of those jobs that were being created, any credit for those jobs that are being created, any credit for the investment decisions that businesses across the country are making, and of course he didn't want to give the government any credit for the policies that are encouraging businesses to do just that. Well, Mr Speaker, the one thing we know about the Labor Party is that they run debt and deficit regardless of the season. Global growth in 2010 and 2011 was 5.4% and 4.2%. It's very strong. That's when they ran a $47 billion deficit. And, Mr Speaker, they kept running deficits at a time when the iron ore price was $150 a tonne. So even when commodity prices were high, economic growth was high, Labor, addicted to spending, kept on spending, and kept on running up larger and larger deficits. And they left us with a structural deficit which we have been deliberately and consistently winding back. And that is why we are bringing the budget back into balance. And, Mr Speaker, the reality is this: Labor does not have a single policy that would encourage one Australian business to invest $1 or hire one person. They used to have policies like that. They did. They had policies of reducing business taxes. In fact, the gentleman that's interjecting, Mr Speaker, he wrote a book about it. He was so convinced of it. He did. He wrote a book. It can be found wherever remaindering occurs. You can find it. There are piles of them. As Clive James said, it's piled up there next to the Kung Fu cookbook. You can get it anywhere. Lots of them. By the gross, Mr Speaker. There's so many for sale. It's an artefact. It'll be in the museum. But the reality is Australians need to know that they have a government that is going to back them, that is going to deliver stronger economic growth, ensure hard-working families keep more of the money they have earned, guarantee essential services and ensure government lives within its means. That's our commitment.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on recent announcements in nation-building, job-creating regional infrastructure, including in my electorate of Cowper? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would like to thank the member for Cowper for his passionate advocacy for Coffs Harbour, for the Mid-North Coast and the Coffs Bypass. It's an important project. I also note the advocacy of the member for Page, for whom this is also a project which is going to benefit his electorate. I was in Page in March inspecting the construction of the Harwood Bridge, another important link in the Pacific Highway. It's an absolute engineering masterpiece as well. And just yesterday we announced funding of $971 million for the Coffs Harbour Bypass. And this has been a project called for by the community for decades and committed to by this Liberal Nationals government. The Coffs Bypass will reduce travel times. Perhaps more importantly, it will save lives. This project will create hundreds of jobs during construction on the North Coast. Construction will start in 2020 once the environmental aspects are taken care of and the engineering details are also looked at, and we expect the project to be finished in 2023. The Mayor of Coffs Harbour, Councillor Denise Knight, said she was thrilled. We've waited a long time for this. It shows what we can do when all levels of government work together, and that's exactly what's happening. And I also praise the National Party member for Coffs Harbour, the state government's member there, Andrew Fraser, for his passionate advocacy over many, many years. The Coffs Bypass is part of our broader Pacific Highway funding package. It's now up to $5.46 billion, Mr Speaker, meaning there is hundreds of kilometres of upgraded highway from Sydney almost to Grafton for the thousands of people who drive along it every day. We're getting on with the job. $3.3 billion for the Bruce Highway projects, $1 billion for the M1 Pacific motorway upgrades, $5 billion for the long-awaited Melbourne Airport rail link, Tullamarine linking it to the CBD, $1.1 billion for further Metronet projects in Perth, to list a few of the nation-building infrastructure projects that we've committed to. Our pipeline of infrastructure projects, our decade-long plan of investment is large. It's creating 50,000 direct and indirect jobs over the 10 years, all helping people get home faster and sooner. But, Mr Speaker, on a bipartisan note, I do want to acknowledge somebody in the gallery, and it's Peter Fraser, sitting up there in the front row with his yellow tie. And I'm so pleased to see so many members wearing the yellow badge, the yellow pin to mark National Road Safety Week, which concluded in Wagga Wagga on Sunday. Mr Speaker, Peter Fraser lost his daughter Sarah when she was travelling to Charles Sturt University to study. Like so many kids do, they travel our regional roads, they travel our highways and byways. She lost her life, and sadly the tow truck driver, Jeff Clark, who pulled up to help her, also was killed. That happened in February 2012. He has been a tireless and passionate advocate for road safety. I acknowledge him, the government acknowledges him, the parliament acknowledges him for his work that he has done. He has an organisation called Sarah after his beautiful daughter, Safer Australian Roads and Highways. Mr Speaker, I commend him for his work and for everything that he has done for road safety, Mr Speaker.
And the member for Grainler on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On indulgence, I join with the Deputy Prime Minister in welcoming Peter to the Parliament and to acknowledge the fine work that he has done in the name of his daughter Sarah. Road safety is something that should unite everyone in this Parliament because it impacts on every one of us as individuals, knows people who have been impacted directly by it, and we all represent constituents and families that have been tragically hurt too often by it. And I think we have a bipartisan pledge to do what we can to reduce the level of road trauma around Australia.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Former Treasurer Peter Costello reckons he'll be dead before the government pays back its debt.
Members on my
Can
right.
the Prime Minister confirm that since coming to office,
Member for Rankin will resume his seat. Members on my right, the members for Deakin, the Leader of the House, will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The member for Rankin will begin his question again.
Very good.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is still to the Prime Minister. Former Treasurer Peter Costello reckons he'll be dead before the government pays back its debt. Can the Prime Minister confirm that since coming to office, his government has increased gross debt by nearly $10,000 for every man, woman and child in Australia?
Wow.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and it does have a great nostalgic resonance to it. The honourable member was formerly Chief of Staff to the then Treasurer, the member for Lilly, the world's greatest treasurer. So, the king of debt himself. And while the member for Rankin was carefully managing, helping the member for Lilly to manage the finances of the nation,
the member for Rankin,
they were responsible for failures in border protection, including a $14 billion blowout, failing to keep our borders secure, a school halls program wasted $8 billion, a pink bats program that was cost lives and also wasted $2.4 billion, 16,000 stimulus checks, $900 to people who are deceased, and 27,000 to people living overseas, presumably to stimulate economic activity outside Australia. There was a $1.4 billion blowout.
The Prime Minister resume his seat for a second. I know the member for Rankin's trying to get some practice in after a bit of a break. I've warned him. He may want to go to the lock-up a little early. I'm happy to facilitate. No, not so soon. Just, I know you're keen, but you're well and truly warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker,
and the member for McEwen won't be let in the lock-up, I'm sure, so there's no need for him to interject.
Mr. Speaker, there was an $850 million blowout in the solar homes program, one financial fiasco after another under the Labor government, in which the member for Rankin played a key part as the top advisor to the member for Lilly as Treasurer. The Treasurer, who we all recall announcing 4 surpluses. Sadly for the nation, he didn't deliver one. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party, there is no group of people in Australia are less qualified to lecture any of us on debt and deficit than the Labor Party. The last Labor Party surplus was delivered in 1989.
Is this a question? Yeah, it's the independence question. I'm just very fair, as you know, Rob. I can observe that. The member for Kennedy.
Minister for Home Affairs, are you aware Australia's principal representative of motoring, the NRMA, Admiral Blackburn's report, said we need clear government assurances that adequate Australian-controlled fuel sources exist to supply essential needs in any disruption, whether political, terrorist or armed conflict. In 2014, 23 days supply, Minister Frydenberg has announced shrinkage to only 20 days. Will government deliver mandating an action as taken in the US, delivering 24% shale oil, 10% ethanol, providing vital security of supply and $7 billion a year in import replacement, and overcoming Frydenberg's shrinkage as well?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
I presume the last part's out of order, Mr. Speaker, so I'll concentrate on the earlier remarks. The member raises a very serious issue, and I want to thank him very much for his passion in relation to fuel security. I'd direct him to the government's response to the parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security their report on the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill 2017, where my department, or the whole of government response, said in part that the risk of espionage, of sabotage and coercive influence in Australia's domestic liquid fuel refinement part of the supply chain has been assessed as relatively low due to the sector's diversity and the resilience of the market system to respond to any disruption at a particular location. The response went on to say, however, the sector is heavily reliant on imports and critical port infrastructure. The infrastructure at ports that support imports of liquid fuel was a key factor in determining which ports are captured by the bill. The critical ports captured by the bill provide 92% of total liquid fuel imports. We went on, Mr Speaker, to respond in this way, to say the government does agree that fuel supply is a critical issue. As such, the committee's concerns, including whether liquid fuel assets should be covered by the bill, be considered at the next National Energy Security Assessment. I'm going to ask, Mr Speaker, the Minister for the Environment and Energy to add to the answer, because he has just announced a review in relation to the issue. But it is obviously, Mr Speaker, a serious issue, and I acknowledge his interest in this matter.
The Minister for the Environment and Energy. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Ordinarily, it's the Prime Minister who delegates different ministers. Now, if the Minister for Home Affairs has now assumed that role, the House should be advised. But he doesn't get to pick who, unless the Prime Minister gives an indication. Ministers can't halfway through say, "Oh, I don't want to answer anymore, I'll flick past to one of my colleagues."
I think you'll find that's not right. Whilst ordinarily is right, ordinarily it is the Prime Minister who's been asked the question, but it is within the practice, and there is some precedent for it. The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, while the Labor Party doesn't think this is a serious issue, we on this side of the House understand its importance, and we understand the nature of the question from the member for Kennedy. The fact of the matter is that Australia's liquid fuels, which is petrol, which is diesel, which is jet fuel, is extremely important. And we are importing 75% of our crude and more than 55% of our refined product. And we're increasing our reliance on imports because over the last decade, 3 out of our 7 refineries have closed, and our domestic oil production has decreased by 1/3 as some of the existing oil fields are exhausted. So we're working with the International Energy Agency, we're working across government, and I note the interest paid by members of this side of the House to this issue, including the member for Canning and Senator Molan and Senator Fawcett, who have also raised issues related to fuel security. The report by the Department of Energy and Environment will be back to government before the end of the year and will form part of our NOPSEMA report in 2019.
Just before I call the member for Chisholm, I'll just, on the point of order by the Manager of Opposition Business, it was a reasonable point of order given the circumstances. The Prime Minister, of course, can refer a question to any of his ministers within their portfolio area. Where a question relates to the responsibilities of both ministers, it is open and reasonable that occurred. So the Minister for the Environment and Energy, the question related to his portfolio responsibilities. The Minister for Home Affairs simply couldn't refer the allotted remaining time to another minister. So I hope that clarifies things, and that was perfectly in order. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the Minister...
Members on my left will cease interjecting. There will not be a repetition of that. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Thanks for the applause. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of ensuring a strong economy for all Australians? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the very hard-working member for Chisholm for her question. and for her very strong advocacy on behalf of her constituency. She, of course, can be very proud of the record funding for infrastructure in our home state of Victoria. She's been an incredibly strong advocate for that. She knows that a strong economy is absolutely vital to improving the prosperity of all Australians. And we on this side of the House have been implementing our economic plan that has seen the creation of just under 1 million jobs since we came to government. As Minister for Women, I'm particularly pleased to note that there are more women working now, with 5.8 million women employed in Australia. The Coalition, of course, has taken action to strengthen our economy by also taking action to strengthen the integrity of our taxation system. We have established the Tax Avoidance Task Force. We have introduced and implemented the multinational anti-avoidance law, despite the fact that those opposite did not support it. We are also tackling the black economy by establishing the Illicit Tobacco Task Force, by cracking down on those who seek to evade taxes and who would seek to fund and finance organised crime. But by continuing to make sure that we have integrity in our taxation system, the government is able to guarantee the important services that Australians, millions of Australians, rely on, whether they be Medicare, defence, schools, hospitals, aged care, disability services, to name just a few. It can mean that we can continue our commitment to relieve the tax burden on hard-working Australians and all of those businesses that employ them. I note, though, Mr Speaker, that those opposite have a very different approach. They have got a high taxing approach, which of course is in marked opposition to us. And I'm very sorry that the member for Fenner isn't actually here, because he is very fond of quoting the politician Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who said the art of taxation consists of plucking the goose so as to get the most feathers with the least hissing. Well, I think that even those opposite would have to agree that more than $200 billion of new or higher taxes that the Labor Party have promised would leave both the goose and the Australian economy well and truly plucked. And I do think that the member for McMahon, with his audacious claims in trying to actually lecture the government on surpluses, should in fact remember that he was in fact a treasurer, and he in fact did not deliver a surplus. In fact, the last time those opposite delivered a surplus was in the 1980s.
The member for McEwen has the call.
This is the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister supported cutting the penalty rates of nearly 700,000 Australians by up to $77 a week. So will the Prime Minister guarantee that any personal income tax relief in tonight's budget will make up for the $77 every week he supports cutting from the pay of ordinary workers?
Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and we all recall the halcyon days when the honourable member was a great defender of the independent umpire, the Fair Work Commission. But he's
the member for McEwen.
He's conceded that he used to be a supporter of the Fair Work Commission, but he abandoned it. He abandoned it when it gave a decision that didn't suit him. Mr Speaker, I want to encourage the honourable member to return to the path of good sense and our great Labor tradition of supporting the independent umpire. And as for the budget, well, the honourable member does not have long to wait.
The member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how a strong economy enables the government to subsidise life-saving medicine for spinal muscular atrophy patients, including those in my electorate of Corangamite? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Corangamite, who's absolutely right. A strong economy is absolutely critical to guaranteeing essential services. A strong economy helps guarantee essential services such as Medicare and hospitals funding, mental health funding and aged care funding, and of course the support through the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme for life-saving medicines. one of the things that this government has done since coming to office is to support life-saving medicines through the PBS, approaching $9 billion of current or soon-to-be listed medicines, such as those outlined by the Prime Minister, Opdivo for lung cancer, an almost $1 billion investment by this government, Keytruda for Hodgkin's lymphoma, again another potentially life-saving medicine. And then just on the weekend, I was honoured to be joined by the member for Corangamite when we met with the families of beautiful young children with spinal muscular atrophy. Now, this condition is, in many cases, a tragic condition. It's the largest genetically inherited condition in terms of the taking of lives of children under 2 years of age. So it's something which until now has had very little opportunity for treatment and very little opportunity for giving parents real and profound hope. I was honoured with the member for Corangamite to be able to announce that as of the 1st of June, but with immediate compassionate access for every patient in Australia, the drug Spinraza will now be made available for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy. And this is a drug which would otherwise have cost families $367,000, beyond the reach of virtually every Australian family. And what that means is that these families and these parents have hope, have the ability to give their children a better quality of life, and if delivered early enough, the ability to have a long life and a full life. And that is profound, and it can only come from a strong economy which allows you to deliver those services. And the proof is that not everybody is able to deliver those services. When the other side was in power, they delayed or denied the listing of 7 fundamental drugs. And they didn't do it because they were evil. They did it because they were economically incompetent. They were economically incompetent and they could not afford to fund the PBS. So that's what this budget is about. That's what a strong economy is.
The minister will resume his seat. The minister does not have the call. The member for Ballarat on a point
In order
of
for the minister to be relevant,
the
perhaps you can explain why you're delaying listings of non.
The member for Ballarat is warned. The minister will just resume his seat. The member for Ballarat has been warned, and she's been warned on a couple of occasions now for approaching the dispatch box and not stating a point of order. I want to make it perfectly clear the next time it happens she will be ejected. The minister has the call for the remaining 19 seconds.
When they were last in government, they denied the listing of medicines for asthma, for schizophrenia, for pulmonary conditions. So this is about whether or not you can run the economy and you can guarantee essential services. That's what we're doing, and that is real compassion.
The minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
My questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to leaked reports of the budget overnight. How is it fair for the Prime Minister to give workers a $10 a week tax cut while giving the Commonwealth Bank a $7.5 million tax handout every week?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I'm pleased that he's so interested in what the Treasurer is going to say at 7:30 tonight. I encourage him to pay close attention. He'll see that the budget is going to deliver the commitments we made in 2016, a stronger economy and more jobs. It's going to deliver a reduction in the cost of living pressures on hard-working Australian families so they can keep more of their hard-earned income. It's going to guarantee essential services, it's going to deliver vital infrastructure, and it is going to ensure that the government lives within its means. That's our commitment. I'm sure the honourable member will be here at 7:30, and I'm sure he'll be paying very close attention.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on the government's actions to create a stronger economy by putting downward pressure on power bills for hard-working Australian families and businesses since the 2017 budget? Is the minister aware of different policy approaches that may interfere with this?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Gilmore for her question. And she knows what an incredible energy mess we inherited from those opposite, Mr Speaker. Power bills went up by more than 100% when they were in office. In your own words, in Labor's own words, network prices skyrocketed. Retail prices soared. We were saddled with a $15 billion carbon tax, and Labor in government ignored the recommendations of the independent market operator when it came to gas. Now, no one put it better than the member for Port Adelaide himself, Mr Speaker. He had a book, The Climate Wars, which you can find also at a good remainder bookshelves, Mr Speaker, where he said that when Labor was in office, when it came to climate and energy policy, they made mistakes. They were his words. They sent mixed messages, Mr Speaker. And he said the people of Australia were determined to see the back of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. And this guy is now running for the presidency again, Mr Speaker. Now, when we came to office, we started to rein in the power of the networks. We abolished the limited merits review process, which, if Labor had done it previously, would have saved consumers $6.5 billion, Mr Speaker. We ensured more gas could come into the domestic market rather than going for export, which the ACCC has reported has seen a fall by up to 50% in the gas price, Mr Speaker. We've got better deals for thousands of Australian families from their retailers. And we've invested in storage like Snowy 2.0, which will help provide a battery for the east coast of Australia. And the National Energy Guarantee, which for the first time will bring energy and climate policy together, has been warmly received by the big employers around the country as well as the energy retailers themselves, Mr Speaker. Now, what is the alternative to this? What is the Labor Party's approach? Well, firstly, they're proposing a 50% renewable energy target, Mr Speaker, a 45% emissions reduction target, which the business community says is risky and unnecessary, Mr Speaker. And when you talk about Labor's priorities going all wrong, there's no better example than their national platform, Mr Speaker, because in this national platform they mention the terms climate change more than 90 times, but how many times is power prices mentioned, Mr Speaker? How many times? 50 times? 40 times? 30 times? No, 6 times, Mr Speaker. 90 times plus for climate change, 6 times for energy prices. When Labor was last in office, power prices more than doubled. If Labor got another chance, it would happen again. Only the coalition will deliver reliable and affordable power.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The chair of the Energy Security Board, Dr Kerry Schott, has said there is no way new coal-fired power plants will be developed under the National Energy Guarantee. Does the Prime Minister agree with Dr Schott, or does he agree with his colleagues, the Minister for Resources, Senator Canavan, and the member for Hughes, who have attacked Dr Schott over her comments?
The Prime Minister has to call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, let me say the National Energy Guarantee, that's the government's energy policy, which brings together for the first time climate and energy policy in one market-based instrument. That is technology agnostic, and that provides a level playing field in which there is a role for every form of power generation, including thermal generation such as coal and gas, and of course all of the different renewables and dispatchable powers, dispatchable source of energy of every kind. Mr Speaker, it is up to the market to determine as to what investments to make. Everybody is entitled to have their opinion. Everyone's entitled to have their opinion. The role of the government is to set out a level playing field so that we end the picking winners, picking technology winners, so that the market can respond and those who run energy companies, generators, will be able to make their own informed business decisions.
The member for Tangney.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the Minister update the House on progress towards a national redress scheme for survivors of child sexual abuse?
The Minister for Social Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member for Tangi for his question. Like members on both sides, he understands the important role that the National Redress Scheme for survivors of institutional child sexual abuse will play in acknowledging, supporting and providing financial assistance to people who experienced sexual abuse. The government is committed to establishing a national scheme to ensure fair and consistent treatment for all survivors. On 9 March this year, both New South Wales and Victoria announced with the Prime Minister at Kirribilli House that they were opting into the scheme. And at that meeting at Kirribilli House, the Prime Minister also announced that there would be a national apology later in the year, and I'm sure that that's something that all members of this House welcome. Since then, the ACT and Queensland have opted in, while the Northern Territory is very close. Productive discussions with Western Australia, South Australia and Tasmania continue. I have also had a number of very constructive consultations with non-government institutions, and I am confident that we will achieve a truly national scheme that provides redress right across the nation. The path is clear. Last week, New South Wales introduced its referral legislation, and later this week the national bill will be introduced into the House. With the will of this parliament, the redress scheme will start on 1 July this year and offer access to psychological counselling, a direct personal response from the responsible institution and a monetary payment. In addition, the government will be establishing community-based support services to support survivors during the redress application process. Survivors will also have access to free specialised legal support services. The time for survivors to wait is hopefully over. We will continue to work with the remaining governments and non-government institutions to ensure the redress scheme is truly national. Survivors deserve nothing less. And I know that I speak for all members of this parliament when I say to those survivors, and I met with a group of them yesterday, that all of us in this place want to do all we can to make sure that they get the redress that they deserve.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do have a question to the Prime Minister, but may I very briefly, before I go to that, associate the opposition with the Minister's comments on the necessity for a truly national redress scheme.
And I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Labor members have been contacted by victims of the rorts and rip-offs of the banks. Those victims, in some cases, have been required to sign non-disclosure agreements to get compensation. Can the Prime Minister assure the victims of bank misconduct who have been silenced by non-disclosure agreements, including my constituent, that if they give evidence to the Royal Commission, they will be protected from any adverse legal consequences?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Respond to that question.
Is the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister and the member opposite for the question. It's obviously a very serious issue. Of course, one of the points of difference between any other type of commission of inquiry that's called in a Royal Commission is that the processes and procedures of a Royal Commission are necessarily independent and completely divorced from the government and unable to be affected by government decision, as it should properly be the case. Nevertheless, Commissioner Hayne has addressed this matter in several of his opening addresses at the Royal Commission. The situation is, of course, that many victims of the banks, by consent with the banks, entered into agreements where money was exchanged for wrongs that had occurred, and they were in a number of cases subject to non-disclosure agreements or clauses as part of the overarching agreement. A non-disclosure agreement itself, which governs one of those particular individual settlements, has an effect. Now, what the Royal Commission has noted is that its standing powers enable it, in effect, to override the existence of any of those non-disclosure agreements. Now, the point that you make, I think, is that there will be a small class of those agreements where a question may arise as to whether or not someone who has signed the agreement and subject to the agreement can, in the prima facie instance, alert the Royal Commission to its existence so that the Royal Commission can ask questions with respect to it. What Commissioner Hayne has said, and I don't have the transcript in front of me, so this is necessarily my best recollection of his approach, is very similar to the approach that Royal Commissioners used in the Sexual Abuse Royal Commission, which was of this nature, that if any bank sought to enact a non-disclosure clause in an agreement to prevent someone alerting the Royal Commission as to the existence of the agreement, such that the Royal Commissioner could then override that non-disclosure agreement, that if he became aware of that activity, that he, as the Royal Commissioner, would ensure that the Royal Commissioner placed its microscope scrupulously over that bank, its conduct and the types of agreements it signed. Now, it seemed to us at the time that that was a very proper approach, and precisely the approach and the analogous approach that was taken in the Royal Commission against sexual abuse in organisations which we've just heard about with respect to redress. Now, I'm very happy to brief you further with the actual transcript, but it does seem to us as a government that the Royal Commissioner has done his absolute best within the confines of the law to address that situation. I have not had anyone approach my office specifically with respect to issues of this nature. If you have, then they could be brought to my attention and we can have a look at those on a case-by-case basis.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Aged Care. Will the Minister update the House on the quality aged care services currently being provided to more than 2,600 aged care facilities across the country, including 18 in my electorate of Boothby? How has the government acted to ensure this quality of care since the 2017 budget?
The Minister for Aged Care.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Boothby for her ongoing interest in aged care, the work that you're doing within your electorate with your providers, but more importantly for your question. Following the Carnell-Patterson review, the Turnbull government established and created a new independent National Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, a one-stop shop to prevent failures, highlight any quality concerns and have them quickly rectified. The Commission will have a special focus on risk management and rapid action, including the development of a serious incident response scheme. On the 17th of March, I introduced unannounced visits to all aged care providers, because if they're operating at the level that is required under the Living Longer, Living Better legislation, then there should be no compromise on quality within any of those facilities for 365 days of the year. Since July last year, 4 homes have lost their licences and been closed because they did not meet the 44 quality standards. We know that the vast majority of Australia's more than 2,600 aged care homes and the sector's 366,000 staff give exceptional care. But as we've seen, there can be failures, and we should ensure that we never have another Oakden occur in our country and it's never repeated. Our reforms are in response to what came out of that review. I'm slow to anger, but I must admit that recently the opposition leader, commenting that the system is in crisis and a national disgrace, was not becoming of what I would expect in a bilateral and a bipartisan approach to aged care. This demeans every one of those dedicated aged care workers who achieve, and it achieves nothing but instilling fear into the hearts and minds of older Australians, just like Labor did in the lead-up to the last election when they were peddling Mediscare lies, designed to scare the very people most deserving. For the opposition leader to continue this aged care fear-mongering is verging on the abuse of elder Australians, and it must stop. In contrast, the Turnbull government's priority is positive, supporting, growing and upskilling our aged care workforce to give the best possible care. John Pelaez has been working on a task force looking at the workforce that we need to ensure there is quality workers within the aged care sector. The care of seniors receiving care is paramount. The Turnbull government has the best interests of older Australians at heart, and unlike the opposition who wants to tax them, Labor will abolish the dividend cash refunds for pensioners and retirees on low incomes. Ours is a government that is spending, on average, $1 billion a year to record levels to ensure that we provide the best possible care for aged care work.
The member for Hotham.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has said his decision to block a Royal Commission for almost 2 years was just a political error. Is the Prime Minister aware of reports that it was, quote, common practice for National Australia Bank employees to falsely sign forms as witnesses? Why is the Prime Minister rewarding big business with an $80 billion tax handout, including over $3.3 billion for the National Australia Bank?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister should be questioned on matters that are within his responsibility. And while he might be prepared to answer the question, I do think that is stretching the boundaries of what's within the Prime Minister's responsibility.
I thank the Leader of the House. The Manager of Opposition Business can just resume his seat for a second. I listened very closely to the question. The Leader of the House certainly makes a good point with respect to one part of the question, but certainly the last part of the question was in order with respect to company tax cuts, and the preamble was obviously in order, but with the middle part of the question not being in order, and that's my ruling, it sort of makes that preamble rather defunct. So the Prime Minister can answer the question the part of the question I've ruled relevant, and that's the very last part relating to company tax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable member by a question indicates that the Labor Party is not simply opposed to reducing company tax for companies with turnovers above $50 million, but is determined to reverse the company tax reductions that have already been legislated. So thousands of Australian-owned family businesses, small and medium businesses, that are getting the incentive right now through legislation that has passed the parliament. The honourable member's question indicates Labor is going to go to the next election and say to all of those family businesses, you're going to have to pay more tax.
Will resume his seat. The member for Hotham. I'm trying to call the Manager of Opposition Business, who I'm now calling. Who has the call?
Mr Speaker, given that you only ruled the last part of the question in order for the Prime Minister to be directly relevant, he's got to be referring to the taxation levels applied to the National Australia Bank, which does not fit the definition of a small family business that he's now referring to.
The Manager of Opposition Business. The last part of the question related to company tax, and well, I don't think we're going to go through it all again. I'll keep listening to the Prime Minister unless he's concluded his answer. He's concluded his answer. The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veteran Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on how we're supporting our veterans and their families? What services and programs has the government delivered since the 2017 budget?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do thank the member for Wide Bay for his question, his long-standing interest in veterans issues, and also recognise his service in a different uniform, that of the Queensland Police Service. And, Mr Speaker, we do argue about a lot of things in this place, but there's one area that I think there's no question at all we do have bipartisan support, and that is our commitment, our obligation, our honour, in fact, to care for the needs of veterans and their families. And I want to thank members across the chamber, who many of you attended Anzac Day commemorations in your own electorates, obviously on the 25th of April. And as it's a day for us to respect and remember the service of those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. In the order of 102,000 Australians have lost their lives in conflicts throughout our history, and many more been wounded in those conflicts and peacekeeping missions. But as the Prime Minister himself has said on many occasions, the best way for us to remember those who have served the best way for us to remember those who served and to recognise their efforts in earlier conflicts is to look after veterans of today. And as a new minister in this portfolio, I'm determined to make sure that we do put the interests of veterans first, and more precisely put the interests of veterans and their families first. Currently, Mr Speaker, there are 288,000 Australians who are assisted by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the government invests in the order of $11 billion per year to provide support services to them. This includes services provided by the medical profession, but also access to veterans and veterans family counselling services. And we know, as all members across the chamber know, the impact of mental health issues on veterans and their families is one of great concern, and we're making sure that mental health treatments are applied effectively and in a timely way, because the faster we can provide support to our veterans, the better the chances of recovery. And a key part also, Mr Speaker, of the government's commitment to our veterans is assisting in the transition from the ADF to civilian life. And the Prime Minister, through his Veterans Employment Initiative, is encouraging industry and businesses throughout Australia to recognise the benefits of employing veterans throughout the nation. And I have a simple message, Mr Speaker, to corporate Australia and the wider business community. Employing veterans will be good for your business. They have the skills, they have values, they have the work ethic you need, and they'll make a valuable contribution to your business. We should be proud in this place, Mr Speaker, we should be proud as Australians for the work we do to support our veterans across the nation, but we can always do things better. 100 years ago, the newly formed Repatriation Commission set out to do the right thing by our returning soldiers and their families, and of those who didn't return. The DVA itself is continuing to transform, and I want to thank the former ministers in this place for the work they undertook over the past 12 months, transforming the way we offer services and the way we support veterans and their families. And on behalf of all members on both sides of the chamber, I want to thank those veterans for their service, but also thank those who continue to serve in the Australian Defence Force. You should all be proud of the efforts you make to keep us safe.
Good answer. The member for McEwen. The member for Patterson. No. Brand. Close. Member for Brand.
Oh, not that close.
Just in seating.
Other side of the country.
Right behind you.
Thank you, Speaker.
2,000 Ks.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has said his decision to block a royal commission for almost 2 years was just a political error. Is he aware this meant a 2-year delay of reports that the Commonwealth Bank continued to charge customer fees for advice that was never provided, and charge fees even though a customer had been dead for 10 years? Why is the Prime Minister awarding big business with an $80 billion handout, including over $17 billion for the big banks?
The Prime Minister has the call.
16,000 dead people. Well, I thank the honourable member for a question. And as I've said publicly, the decision that I took, and I take full responsibility for it, not to hold a Royal Commission into the banks 2 years ago, was because I believed we should get on with the substantive reforms to protect consumers, to give people real redress, and we have done that. And we have put in place a one-stop shop for consumers and small business to get effective, cost-effective relief when they've had the wrong thing done to them by banks. That's a very big reform. We've obviously strengthened ASIC. We've given it more money, more powers. We've also introduced a banking executive accountability regime and many other reforms. So that was the decision that the government took, and I take full responsibility for it. I called out the problem in 2016, almost 2 years ago precisely, when I said that what had happened was a culture had developed where customers were not put first. Now, the Royal Commission is being held, and many of the cases that are coming before it, the honourable member says, would not have come to the light of day without a Royal Commission. That may well be so. But the fact of the matter is, the Royal Commission has broad terms of reference. It is up and running. It has the ability not simply to examine the matters before it in terms of past wrongdoings by banks and other financial institutions, but it has the ability, in fact it has the mandate, to examine the effectiveness and appropriateness of the reforms we've already put in place. So that's the important thing, is putting the customers first. It's the mistake the banks and various financial advisors and others made in not putting them first, and I can say to the honourable member and all honourable members, we are determined, one, that this wrongdoing will not happen again, and second, those who have done the wrong thing will be held to account.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Law Enforcement and Cyber Security. Will the minister update the House on the measures the government has introduced to combat serious and organised crime since the 2017 budget?
The Minister for Law Enforcement.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question, because she knows that the first priority of this government is to keep Australians safe and secure. She also knows that in recent decades, criminal syndicates and cyber actors have become more sophisticated than ever before. More international, better organised and more adept at using technology. And the impact of organised crime on the lives of Australians is very real. The ACIC tells us that the cost per year is around $36 billion. That's 2% of GDP. But of course, we know that the cost in human suffering, of human trafficking, of child exploitation, of illicit drugs cannot be counted, cannot be quantified. We need to be more sophisticated, more international, better coordinated and more adept at using technology than ever before, because these criminals are attacking us in our homes, in our businesses, in our communities, on our infrastructure, on our phones, and of course on our computers. And of course that is the rationale for establishing the Home Affairs portfolio, the most significant reform to national security arrangements in this country in 40 years. Now, Mr Speaker, last week the Minister for Home Affairs and I announced Australia's first transnational and serious organised crime coordinator, Mr Carl Kent, who is a Deputy Commissioner of the AFP. And this coordinator role will deliver a new strategy for disrupting serious and organised crime and overseeing the $70 million establishment of the Australian Centre for Countering Child Exploitation, which we anticipate will save more than 200 child victims each year. Now, Mr Speaker, better coordination across Home Affairs is already delivering results. And we saw a number of our agencies in recent months working together with our international partners to disrupt the most sophisticated criminal telecommunications network we have ever seen in Phantom Secure. Phantom Secure had more than 10,000 devices being used by criminals in this country, and it was disrupted in recent months through the very good work of our agencies. Reforms to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws came into, as well as regulation of cryptocurrencies, came into effect last month, and we've seen unprecedented disruption of illicit drugs coming to our borders, including a 1.2 tonne, over $1 billion of methamphetamines near Geraldton. This government will work tirelessly alongside the fine men and women of our law enforcement and national security agencies to keep Australians safe.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Kingsford Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question's to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, your government's giving a $17 billion handout to the big banks. Under your policy of giving tax cuts to big businesses, how much will go to AMP? And is now really the right time to be rewarding a company like that?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the honourable member to my earlier answer. I'm not going to go into specific matters which are currently before the Royal Commission, but as I said, and I'll repeat it, that we are determined to ensure that the wrongdoing that has occurred, where customers have not been put first, does not happen again, and that those who have done the wrong thing are held to account. And obviously the Royal Commission is operating, but leaving the Royal Commission to one side, we have beefed up the powers and capacities of the regulator. Now, in terms of major banks, I would just remind the honourable member that we have, in the last year's budget, introduced and legislated a major bank levy, which is raising around $1.5 billion a year, and cumulatively will increase to $10 billion by 2023-24. So a very substantial increase in tax paid by the major banks.
The member for O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Human Services. Will the minister update the House on the government's efforts to crack down on overpayments of taxpayer-funded welfare since the 2017 budget? Minister, are there any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Human Services.
Well, can I thank the member very much for his question and for his interest in these matters. And he is aware that thousands of former welfare recipients, this is people who have now moved from the welfare system into the workforce, currently owe us $905 million in unpaid debts. Now, this is an extraordinarily large amount, and the government believes that people who have received welfare payments that they are not entitled to are required to pay that money back. Now, some of these cases involve serious criminality, including one person who defrauded $800,000 from the Commonwealth but is still refusing to enter into arrangements to pay that money back. Now, we don't think it's unreasonable to expect when people have moved from the welfare system into employment that they repay the almost $1 billion that they have received from Australian taxpayers that they now owe the Commonwealth. Now, we've been working with those who do owe us this money to enter into appropriate repayment arrangements, but those who continually refuse to engage with us will be hit from now on with interest on their debt. This interest will compound daily, and it will continue to compound until they either repay the debt or enter into a repayment plan to pay the taxpayers back that money. Now, this $905 million that we're targeting, that we're aiming to recover, is on top of the $1.5 billion that we've already recovered over the past 18 months through our comprehensive compliance efforts. Now, we are committed to budget repair and ensuring that our welfare system operates with integrity and is sustainable and fair is a very important part of that. Now, I was asked by the member about alternative approaches. Now, under Labor, compliance was not a priority and it took a back seat. Penalties were soft, and the Labor Party completed only 16% of the compliance checks that we are undertaking today. They also slashed the recovery of debt by 50%. When the Howard government left office in 2007, they were collecting $420 million of debt. By the time the Labor Party left office in 2013, they were only collecting $220 million worth of debt. Now, we believe that the best form of welfare remains getting a job, and in the past 2 years, 120,000 Australians who are in the welfare system receiving job-seeking allowance, disability or parenting payments have moved off these payments. 120,000 people. This is a result of measures where we've been encouraging people into work and strengthening our compliance efforts. And of course, this is a generational change in terms of the saving that will be made to the Australian taxpayer because of the integrity with which we are running the system. Now, we believe that most Australians on the welfare system want a job, and we're committed to ensuring that they have the support that they need and the encouragement they need to get a system, to get a job, and that is one of the very important parts of our budget repair, and we'll continue to prioritise.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.